Now go to John Denton. John had a substantial input into the white paper. He's well acquainted with the arguments in the white paper. So my question to you, John, having heard what Philippa's got to say is, did the white paper get it wrong?
Well, can I just flip back before I answer that question? I just want to make a comment if I could about the US. Allow me the liberty.
Of course.
Because it's after dinner. Well, that's not
really
no,
I'm only too keen for you to talk on America.
I think that it's actually interesting to look at US politics, and I look at it from a slightly different prism, which is, what does it say about functioning liberal democracies? And one thing that you can discern, and in a way we can look at a little bit here, but we can look at also in Europe as well, we all have a proud tradition of liberal democracies. What you discern, though, is that there's a lot more goodwill that's actually required to make our systems work. And that when that goodwill gets sucked out, we've got some pretty creaky systems to keep pushing along, and they don't function that well. And I think you can see that as a case in point in the US, where the absence of the kind of goodwill that allowed the Congress to operate has actually been sucked dry, and it's become quite complex, and it's actually quite interesting. It's also quite interesting to look at that more broadly as to what it says about liberal democracies around the globe. And now, of course, you're confronted with situations where real choices need to be made, and those choices will require some substantive trade-offs, and parts of the system will now be sorely tested. And you start to see some of the challenges, particularly in Europe, where there was this sense that democracy was enduring, but when you start seeing the goodwill sucked away as the choices are made, it gets sorely tested. Just an observation more than a debating point.
It's an observation which raises all sorts of issues.
It wasn't trying to avoid the question.
No, I know you weren't. I wouldn't suggest for one moment you were trying to avoid the question. I understand that. But let's just to follow up on what you've just said. Do you think that these recent tribulations in American democracy that you're talking about, is this the new status quo? Is this just a period of transition? If you look at American history, America has had very substantial periods of deep tribulation, whether we're talking now about the Civil War, or if we're talking about the Great Depression, divisions in the 1930s, divisions in the 1920s even in the United States. So what's your judgment? Is it the new status quo, or is it just one of these phases that America goes through in its history?
I see it as a phase. I will now answer your question, because I actually think that the story of America's demise is misunderstood and is just plain wrong. I think, and I was alluding to this in my comments earlier today, that if you think about sources of power in the 21st century, the key source of power is this thing called connectedness and interconnectedness. And I think that if there's an economy in the world that has that in spades, it's the US. It's the mere openness of it all. The fact that generation after generation of migrants come, businesses succeed, fails, sectors rise and fall, etc., and it keeps pushing on, says to me here is a power that will endure.
Okay, well this just raises further the question I asked, which you haven't really answered. I
haven't finished.
well, good, because the question was, because I asked Philippa, should the advisor to the Prime Minister go to China or the United States to see the future? And she said the United States. So I therefore ask, have we somehow got the white paper wrong?
But I think that to allow a conclusion like that to settle is to misunderstand, one, the purpose of the white paper, two, its design, and three, the way in which it's balanced. And if I can say, the purpose of the white paper was never set out as a foreign policy document. Let's be very clear about that. It was really, how do you create an environment and a series of frameworks which can allow a discussion on continuing domestic reform to take place and make sense of it to people who are actually seeing things happen to them without being involved in the process of understanding why this is going on. And that's really the Australian public. I mean, what is the importance of Asia to us? Why is it relevant to them? Don't they deserve a discussion about their future? And in many respects, if you look at the way the white paper is framed, it sets up irrefutably the importance of the Asian century, and then tries to find a way to reach out and explain, well, how can we as a nation rise up to the challenges, be aware of the opportunities, also be aware of the pitfalls, but it will require more change, not less, and it will not necessarily be straightforward. It also creates a framework for us to have some of these debates about trade-offs. And that's when you get to the issue that you hear talked about. Should we trade off our values to further integrate into Asia? Should we trade off our democracy to further integrate into Asia? Should we trade off our relationship with the US to further integrate into Asia? I, by the way, don't believe the answer to the question is yes, yes, and yes. I actually think we need to have the discussion, though, because it's actually a much more vital part of the broader political discussion in Australia than I might have thought. There are senior people in this country who do think that we should trade off part of our relationship with the US as we look towards China. In many respects, I think if China had its dream outcome, that might be one of the things on it, but they don't expect to get that.
Okay, well, hold that thought, because what I want to do is I want to come back to you and identify more about what you think we've got to keep and what you think we've got to lose. So